Want to remind everyone, of course, to download, rate, and subscribe to the 415ers podcast. As always, 3 times a week, even during buys on the Odyssey Sports Podcast Network with 95.7 The Game. Evan Giddings and Marc Randy with you. So, it's certainly something to keep an eye on, Mark, and that's an interesting point that I'll definitely note moving forward.
Yeah, no, I will too. And I think, a lot of the potential success of the 49ers as they try to win the division in the NFC West and as they try to, make another postseason run, which we'll get to in a second. I think a lot of it could ultimately, I mean, obviously it's going to come down to the quarterback play, but a lot of it could come down to potentially Jimmy Garoppolo's ability to complete a pass 25 yards down the field in a big fourth quarter against potentially the Seahawks towards the end of the regular season, maybe to win the division. Who would have thought that was possible? Or maybe it's a division postseason game where you're down by 4 points in the final minute 30 of the game, and you need a big shot down the field to Brandon Ayuk. Like a lot of it could come down to one deep throw by Jimmy Garoppolo, and if he really is feeling better at throwing that ball, that could be the difference in the season continuing or perhaps not at all. So very, very important. And I'll be certainly keeping an eye on how he is able to deliver the ball deep down the field to some of his targets.
Yeah, I think a lot of 49ers fans are getting nightmares when you bring up that scenario. Just imagine Jimmy Garoppolo on his own 10-yard line with no timeouts, down a score with 2 minutes left in a playoff game.
Yeah, where have we seen this story before? I can't quite place it.
No, but that does take us to the next point of our conversation, the episode today, which is, will it be easier or not for the 49ers the way they're currently constructed to win in the playoffs than the regular season? Because this was something that we brought up all the way back when Trey Lance unfortunately got hurt and was out for the season, and Jimmy had to come in week 2 against Seattle. I originally felt, Mark, and I think I still do, that the 49ers are closer to the playoffs with Jimmy G as quarterback, but they are further from the Super Bowl. And I feel like them in the regular season, partially because of how banged up they've been, but also because of just simply who their quarterback is and who they're probably going to run into in the postseason, just makes it so much more difficult for me to believe that this team can go on the road potentially for at 1 or maybe 2 or more playoff games and win it all. Like, so right now they are the 7th seed. They are tied with Washington, but they have the tiebreaker due to conference. So they are 4-4. They are the 7th seed. That would put them on the road for their entire playoff path. I feel like it's a lot to ask, even with the addition of Christian McCaffrey, even with hopefully the defense getting healthy in the middle to later part of the season. I think it's a lot to ask this team to go win that many playoff games on the road, despite the fact that I guess they did it last year. I still believe, to me, that they are closer to the playoffs with Jimmy as quarterback, but they're also further from the Super Bowl, if that makes sense.
So does that mean, yeah, you're right. We've had this conversation or various kind of offshoots of it before, but it was a question that was actually not even a question, a statement made by Tim Kawakami and The Athletic earlier this week that kind of jump started my brain to start thinking about this again. So they're closer to the playoffs, in your opinion, but further from the Super Bowl. Does that mean that it is easier for them to make the playoffs than for them to win in the playoffs? Are you
Yes.
disagreeing? Okay, gotcha. I think I fall on the opposite side of things there. I think it it is harder for the 49ers to make the playoffs than to win in the playoffs. And the way I think about this is I'm gonna, jump back to, when I took statistics in high school. Standard deviation. I think the Niners standard deviation is much smaller. It's a low standard deviation than just about any other NFL team. Of course, think of a bell curve, on a graph where you have, the two sides low on either end, and then they meet up in the middle at a high point, the bell curve graph. The Niners standard deviation is really close to the top of the bell curve. They don't have too much variation to either side. There are, of course, moments. The Atlanta game stands out, but when the team is fully healthy and they have their full team, their standard deviation is pretty small. You know what you're going to get generally. It might not always be the very peak, but it's going to be relatively close. Meanwhile, other teams, and this is specifically in the regular season for these other teams, they have a larger standard deviation. There are games where they might exceed their normal peak and just be phenomenal and impossible to beat. Think the Kansas City Chiefs or the Buffalo Bills when they are absolutely rolling, when Josh Allen is leaping over defenders, throwing 5 touchdowns or running another one in, 6 total touchdowns. They're impossible to beat. But there are also moments for teams like that where they perform quite a bit worse than their average because they just in general are more volatile teams. The 49ers, though, are not. And what tends to happen in the playoffs, the game just kind of goes right back to the basics. Can you run the ball and do you have a good defense? And that's what the Niners do throughout the entire regular season. And that's generally why their standard deviation is smaller because when you run the ball, when you have a good defense, you're just shortening the game. You're whittling down the clock. You're taking away those opportunities for you to one have that absolutely incredible performance where you blow a team out of the water on one extreme, but you're also taking away the ability more so for you to have an absolutely terrible performance and you could lose to the worst team in the league. The Niners and the way that they are constructed, they're so consistent when they're fully right. And I think that exactly leads in to what you want in playoff football. But there are times where you just run into a buzzsaw. You run into a good team who's on their best day with a gigantic standard deviation, and they can beat you in the regular season. So I think for that reason, the Niners are built for the playoffs. And in general, the nature of playoff football is what the Niners are best at. And it's no coincidence. That's why they built the team the way they did, because they feel if they can just make the playoffs, they'll have a fantastic shot of making a run.
Yeah, that's true. And I'm with you as far as the bell curve is concerned. They probably will end up being the most consistent looking team in the NFC in the playoffs. Although, well, I guess we got to see what Philly becomes. To me, they are by far
Yeah.
the cream of the
They're
crop in the
I think
NFC.
they're right there with the Niners, kind of in that similar argument. And they have maybe
They're
even
with the Niners.
I mean, in terms of the argument that they are built for postseason football. I
Okay.
think they also have a more dynamic passing attack, and they also have the added, strength of Jalen Hurts' running ability, which gives them a different level. But I think in general, when you think about a running game and a good defense, they are, along with the Niners, I think the two NFC teams best built for the playoffs. But I would say that in general, the Eagles are the better team.
Yeah, I mean, look, right now in terms of record, it's pretty lopsided. I have an issue with. I mean, yeah, okay, on a spreadsheet, the Niners look good. I would agree with that. But eventually, in playoff games, you're going to get into a scenario where you do not get to just run the ball and blow out the other team. There's going to be a situation in which you are probably going to have to come from behind at one of many points throughout a ball game. And unfortunately, I know I guess to some fans, argument sort of wrote that wrong this week against the Rams. Uh, but what's the one thing that they have struggled to do all year? And really, what's the one thing they've struggled to do the entire tenure of Kyle Shanahan? That's come from behind. I mean, whether it's early, late, fourth quarter, third quarter, it doesn't matter. Now, a lot of that has to do with the quarterback, the guy that we started this episode talking about, Jimmy Garoppolo. I think if you stack the Niners up against pretty much every team in the NFC, outside of maybe Seattle if they end up getting to the playoffs. But the 49ers are going to have, yes, a better overall roster than the majority of the teams that they're going to face. I still honestly really like Minnesota. I know some people don't. I think Dallas sneakily has a quality defense, and if Dak Prescott can hold his own weight, that could be a team to mess with. The only issue is that Dallas, along with New York and Philly, are all going to be in the same division, beating each other up. But again, like I just have a tough time putting the Niners over the top of those teams because of who is under center. And that eventually in modern NFL playoff games, as we saw last year multiple times, and even going back to the last few years, we have seen you need a guy that can win you a game. And unfortunately, I just don't think the 49ers have that guy. I think it plays during the regular season because of all the reasons you mentioned. I think they are a steady team. I think they are a team that shows up relatively consistently each and every week. And that's going to get you wins because I think the 49ers can beat the teams that they are supposed to or will be able to, although they didn't do it against Atlanta. I think they'll be able to beat teams the rest of the way once they get healthy at their full strength. They are a team that you can kind of pencil in wins for, in my opinion. But that doesn't apply once the postseason starts. I understand defense travels. I understand running travels. But at some point, if you're not going to be up by 10, 17 points, also a place that Kyle Shanahan throughout his career, not just in San Francisco, has also kind of struggled a little bit with leads. To me, there is too much volatility in the playoffs. Like that's what football is. And so eventually you're going to have a spot, a scenario, a game where you're looking at the other sideline and saying, we got to stop that quarterback. Man, that's going to be tough. Meanwhile, the other team is going to be looking at you and saying, we got to stop that quarterback. Oh, whew, all right. Well, we're going to lick our chops and go with our guy.
Well, I don't know. I don't know if, and past isn't any indicator of what's going to happen, but I don't know if the Niners' past postseason games, aside from the matchup against who the guy who might retire as the greatest quarterback of all time, Patrick Mahomes, I'm not sure that. Uh, and maybe you can make the argument the NFC Championship game last year, but that was a lead for the 49ers, and the defense kind of melted away in the second half. But besides those two and really just the Super Bowl loss to the Chiefs, I mean, there's no other postseason games that you can point to and say, you know, that that was true. I mean, the 49ers, what they won against the Vikings in 2019, just absolutely dominated. The ground game was fantastic. Jimmy Garoppolo didn't need to do that much.
Yeah.
Packers in the NFC Championship game, it was even more to that point, even more extreme. Then, of course, the Super Bowl, as we mentioned, last year in the playoffs, they win in Dallas. Jimmy Garoppolo was, he needed to do some. The team got a big lead and they barely held on at the end. That was mostly thanks to the run game. Deebo Samuel was incredible in that game as well. The defense, fantastic through the first, 3 quarters in that one. The snow game in Lambeau to get to the NFC Championship game. I mean, Jimmy Garoppolo, hard pressed to ask him to do less than what he did in that game. The punt block, that went for a touchdown for Talanoa Hufanga. The defense was great. I think the Niners have proven time and time again that one, yes, of course, you would love to have kind of that elite quarterback like a Patrick Mahomes and like a Josh Allen, but two, that they have proven that they can win without guys like that because of the way that they have constructed this team. And it's not by any accident that they've built it this way. It's what the plan has been from Shanahan and Lynch since they took over. Build the defense, build an offensive line, build a run game, and then we'll see what we got with the quarterback. And that's the way it's happened. Now, I think there's maybe a difference in how we're defining win in the playoffs. If the conversation was, is it harder for the 49ers to make the playoffs or win the Super Bowl? Obviously, I would say it's harder to win the Super Bowl, but to win in the playoffs, let's win one game, maybe get to the NFC Championship game. I think that's a very realistic scenario for the 49ers, especially when you consider they should be able to win the NFC West. I think they're still the odds on the betting favorite right now, despite the fact that Seattle is a game ahead. If you win the NFC West, you are going to be, in all likelihood, at worst, the 3 seed because the NFC South champion could very well be under 500. Right now, the Falcons are at 4-4, and they're leading that division. So if you win the NFC West, most likely you're going to be the 3 seed at worst, which means you could play someone like potentially the Giants. If you were the 3 right now, the Giants are the 6, that would be your first round matchup. I see absolutely no reason why the 49ers could not win that game. You could get someone like, I don't know, perhaps the Cowboys. They fall off from second in the NFC West and they lose a few, or in the NFC East, and they lose a few games and they're the 6th seed. I think the 49ers, even with Jimmy Garoppolo and his deficiencies, considering what they've done in the postseason in the past, have a very, very realistic shot to, if they get into the playoffs, to win at least one game, and it's because of the nature in which they play football.
I mean, yeah, I think in this NFC, you could also make that case for virtually any team. The 49ers won't be afraid, yes, of the Giants at home or on the road, frankly. The Giants also shouldn't necessarily be afraid of the 49ers any more than they should be afraid of, to me, Dallas, Minnesota, Philadelphia. I mean, if Tampa catches fire, they're a team that I like. I understand what you're saying, but to me, the other part of this too is like the 49ers the rest of the way in the regular season also don't have that tough of a schedule. Like
It's true.
they have I know they have technically three road games. Um although they have a neutral site affair with well, I guess that's on the road. So that would be their third road game. They have 5 home games left.
Yeah, they
Like
travel to Mexico City, to Vegas, and to Seattle, and then everything else is at home.
yeah, and the rest of the teams that they're playing at this point in the season, like you're going to get a really banged up Chargers team coming out of the bye. You're going to Arizona. I know that they have had the 49ers number in recent years, but this is to me is a very different Arizona team. Even with Nuke Hopkins back, like they just to me are not that great of a ball club. The Saints are beatable. Miami does look like a very tough team to play at this point. Tampa Bay is struggling to find out what they're going to be. Seattle on the road is always a tough game for San Francisco, but they handled them once. I expect them to do it again, even though Seattle's playing well currently. Washington is I guess a different football team with Taylor Heineke, but like I'm not a big fan of them. Las Vegas by week 17 might as well have just thrown the white flag in.
Josh
And
McDaniels, is he their head coach by week 17? What do we think?
that is TBD. I think he will be just because I don't think the Raiders are very well run, but he probably shouldn't be by that point. And then you get Arizona at home to finish out the season. So like, I don't know. Their schedule in the regular season is also something that gives me faith that they can create a home field advantage like you're talking about for the playoffs. So, I mean, maybe we're splitting hairs here and it's a lot more even than we're kind of making it at this point, but to me, winning in the regular season for this 49ers team with how they're going to hopefully look coming out of the bye will be easier for them to rack up wins. I'm not saying they're going to go, 7-1 or 7-2 like they did at the tail end of last year after starting out 3-5, but I feel like this team is more easier to project against the regular season opponents they have left than what they'll be facing probably in the postseason.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. And I would generally agree with that. I mean, I think the 49ers should very much make the postseason. Like, if they don't make the postseason at this point, it is a major disappointment. And I mean, you should make it even if you don't win the NFC West, because the middle of the NFC is, as you mentioned, so depressed, and everyone's kind of right around the same level. I mean, San Francisco's 4-4, Washington's 4-4, the Rams are 3-4. Tampa Bay, Green Bay, Arizona, New Orleans, Chicago Bears are all 3-5. So there's so many teams. I mean, you can go down to, let's see, right now there are 14 teams in the NFC. 7 make the playoffs. 14 teams in the NFC at the moment are within a game of the 49ers for the last playoff spot in the NFC. So I mean, there's a lot that's still to be determined. But that, to your point as well, that most of their schedule coming up are winnable games, and that should definitely increase their odds of being able to make the postseason. So I agree.